It's Jeff, and I'm your Director of Education at the Seward House Museum, and I am excited and delighted to be welcoming a guest speaker today, Barbara Büchel. I think I've got her name right, and she can correct me in just a minute, who I've come to know over the spring, and she's just opened up new worlds of understanding about a very interesting and critical period in William Henry Seward's life, the spring and summer of 1869, when he was fresh into his retirement, home from Washington, D.C., and living briefly in the Auburn house before embarking on a trip to Alaska and then around the world. So settling into retirement, not necessarily happily, he has a very interesting house guest, a Swiss artist, Frank Buchser. We have several of his works in the museum on display. Visitors may be most familiar with his Janet on Horseback. And I was aware that Buchser had been on an American tour early on Reconstruction, that he had seen the United States in the days in the aftermath of the Civil War, exploring, unlike so many other artists, what was happening in communities of color, newly freed men and women in the South, scenes in the North as well, trying to capture a sense of that, but not much beyond that, the measure of the man, nor his very interesting relationship with William Seward. Here to shed some light today is Barbara, who contacted us doing research, historical and art history on Buchser. We gave her a virtual tour of the museum and tried to answer some of her questions, and in return have learned so much about the Seward family from behind the canvas of artist Frank Buchser. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to turn everything over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction. I would like to introduce to you the artist Frank Buchser, his origin, I will tell about his personality. Then I would like to consider with you the time he has lived in Switzerland and in America, a very short view on the art, his art in context. And then we will clear the question, why at all did he travel to America? And then, of course, I will focus on the stay at Auburn. And then we have a very, very strange story about sleeve buttons. And of course, I want to show you pictures, and I will install this now. And I hope you will see this now. And this is a self-portrait from Frank Buchser, how he depicts himself when he was 24 years old. So Frank Buchser is born in 1828 and he dies in 1890. At his time, he was quite famous. He sells to museums, he sells to high-cost persons. When he dies, he is quite wealthy. And he really has been a very dazzling personality and a puzzling one as well. And as an example, he says quite often he wants to get world famous, which he did not wholly succeed. And interesting is he never settles down somewhere. He always travels his whole life, and he paints everywhere. He paints in England with shore scenes. He has great successes with portraits in England. He travels in Morocco and paints in a street scene. And we must consider it is forbidden to paint in Fez in Morocco. He traveled a long time in Italy. He traveled in Greece. He traveled in the Albanian mountains, and he had a lot of love affairs. And we know about at least of 2 children, but he really never marries. His freedom was his most important thing in his life. Only once in his life he thinks about marrying, and about this story I will tell you more. And he is really genially gifted as an artist, but as well as making newspapermen write about him. And in my opinion, he is not really enough known, because he was really a genius in art and in many aspects. He was in many aspects ahead of his time. And even a few newspapers of his time say, if he had lived in France and exhibited in Paris, everybody would know him today. So he is born in this house. It still exists. It was a guest house at the time. His father is a farmer, a horse trader. He owns this guest house, and he was not of high birth, he was of low birth, but he was not a poor man. But this father dies when Frank is 3 years old. So his mother must have been a very interesting person as well, because she never marries again, which is not usual at this time. And she had 4 children who reached adulthood, and from letters we still have, is seen that these family members love one another very much. They cling strongly together, and they love their mother really a lot. And this Feldbrunnen is just outside of the city walls of Solothurn. So this is Solothurn as it looked at the time when Frank Buchser lived. It is the main city of the canton Solothurn. It is a city of ambassades, so we have lots of patricians here going in and out. It is a center of mercenary. And Frank, as a bit the bigger boy, he goes his last years to school in town. So as a boy, he knows the country living and as well the city life. He knows the different levels of society, and he sees that very early in his life. As a boy, he must have been a very wild child. So we know that he, as a child, already sells sketches to his schoolmates, and he knows very early that he wants to get an artist and want to get world famous. And he has, as a very, very young man, already love affairs. As an adult, he seems strongly driven, he is ambitious, and he is somehow a little bit torn between different urges. So politically, he is a Democrat, he is for equality, for liberty, he wants to get rich and famous, we know. As an artist, he wants to find and to show the origin of it all. He is always in search of the truth, of the beauty in nature, the primeval beauty, primeval people. He is very energetic, very spirited, lively, and in his soul, he is very romantic. And so he is often as well very contradictious in himself. He has been really a very dazzling personality. And his biographer, Walchli, says he was of demonic vitality. So let's consider the time he has been born in. So it is a time of many changes. In art, it is away from academic painting, away from romanticism, and towards realism. We have in this time a lot of new technologies like photography. This is Frank Buchser himself as a young man. We have railway that is new, we have steamboat that is new, we have a lot of inventions. Farmers get industry workers, we have heavy social changes, we have even revolts everywhere in Europe, not so many in Switzerland, but around Switzerland, many revolts. And Buchser is very good informed about these things, about these changes. He takes part, and he really likes travels, as we know. He took these modern means as railway, steamboats, and he, in his travels, he really was always in search of the origin of it all. He loves native people, he loves painting in the indigenous, primeval people. His sympathies are always with the brigands, with the thieves, with the gypsies, and in America, of course, for the former slaves. So we can really say his inner being is somehow divided. His drive, his urge, his mind is for the modern, and his soul, in his soul, he has a longing and a yearning for the origin. And this shows as well in his art. So very often he depicts poor people, and he feels with these victims of civilization. He paints the poor, he paints them with a scrutinizing realism, but at the same time he romanticizes them, and he very often mingles it with erotic. So he very early did nude painting, and this provokes a lot of rejection in society, because really nobody wants to see paintings of poor people. Nobody wanted to see naked skin, and nude painting at the moment is socially really not acceptable. So his education, we consider a little bit the context of his art. He starts with academic, but he finds this is a picture as well from him, a lake in Switzerland, but he finds this very soon very boring. And in 1855, he travels with friend to the exhibition, and here we have the pavilion of realism of Courbet, and Buchser is really fascinated by the truth and realism of this the paintings of Courbet. This is the Kornzieberin of Courbet, and Courbet really takes his time, and Frank really talks a long time with Courbet and was fascinated. And the friends he traveled with, Frank, complain that he has only time for Courbet, but not for them. So we can say this has really been a turnover in the art of Buchser. So from this moment on, he declares himself an artist of realism. And he paints really with a dissecting observation. He deeply studies his objects, and what he as well does, he starts painting in nature. So it is called plein air. He did this very early, when it was not usual at all. Everybody at this time is painting in the atelier, and he starts as well sketching with a very impressionistic brush. So he calls things like this capriccios, and this, in my opinion, is a little bit tragic, because Frank Buchser, did not recognize in which direction art will develop. He even laughed out the so-called impressionists, and he really thought himself as an artist of realism. And I think really, if he had lived in France, he would have seen this development a bit from another perspective. So let's clear the question, why at all did he go to America? We are now in the year 1864. Buchser is now 36 years old. He had his fights, he had great successes. He has sold already 2 museums. He can live from the money he earns with his art, and he has been elected as head of council of his village, Feldbrunnen. But only 1 year later, he thinks he wants to get influence on the next higher level, and this is the canton Solothurn, and especially he wants to take influence in the reform of art politics. So he becomes a candidate for Council of Canton Solothurn. So before the election, Frank Buchser has been invited by a politician to Café Schöpfer. This is Café Schöpfer as it is today, but it is has been very the same as it is now. And there have been lots of politicians. They have been probably in this room, and the discussion really gets very hot very quickly. And present as well is governing council, Mr. Ackermann, and this man makes a bad joke about the painting of Frank Buchser. Frank Buchser gets very, very angry, and he bangs a tankard on the head of Governing Council Ackermann. So Mr. Ackermann has quite a heavy blessing. He goes to the hospital, he is bleeding, he goes to the police, he makes a case for the Kurd out of it, and every single detail is in the newspapers. And it is very embarrassing for Frank Buchser. Only a few days later, there is a very long and very funny mockery song about the Kaffee Schöpfer, and the coffee is now not called Kaffee Schöpfer, it is called Kaffee Waterloo, and it is really very, very embarrassing for Frank. And of course, he is no longer a candidate for the Council of Canton Solothurn. So at the same time, in Bern, that's the main city of Switzerland, we have other discussions. The Federal Council of Switzerland is very excited and very impressed by the victory of the Union in America, by the victory of democracy. They admire the generals, especially they admire President Lincoln, and of course the liberation of slaves in America. So Switzerland at this moment wants to strengthen the friendship with his sister republic, America. And this building is the federal building, and it has been finished in about 1857, but the inside is not decorated at all because the money, there was no money for the decoration. And so the idea arises that the decoration should be made with something in connection with America. So the council, the Federal Council, builds a commission, and the plan is very quickly taken that a large painting or several paintings should be made, and that persons of this victory in America should be depicted. So for an idol or a model for Swiss politicians. And on these paintings should be Abraham Lincoln, the former president, the new president Andrew Johnson. Then should be on the paintings the Secretary of State William Henry Seward, General Ulysses Grant, and the General William Tecumseh Sherman. And the members of the commission admire Buchser's art. They know about his personality. They know that he travels a lot, and they very soon think Frank Buchser is the man to do this mission. So Frank is very happy to accept this mission. And again, only one month later, the newspapers are full of Frank Buchser, but this time very positively. So many Swiss politicians and army members and newspaper redactors start fundraising, and very soon after, Frank Buchser is sent with 3,000 Swiss francs to America, which is a beautiful amount, but not that grand an amount. So we must know the Federal Council never signs an official contract for this mission, but still Frank receives many recommendation letters from many dignitaries, including a letter of the representative of the United States in Bern to William Henry Seward. So in May 1866, Frank Buchser arrives in America. He lives here in Astor House in New York, and he realizes very soon the atmosphere is difficult. There is hate, there is revenge against the South, there is hate against colored people, there is racism, and in the South there is forced administration. So he stays 1 week in New York. He immediately calls to Swiss consulate, who directs him to Honorable Hiram Barney, who is the formal collector of the Port of New York, who helps a lot and gives more recommendation letters to Frank. for President Andrew Johnson, for Secretary of Treasury Hugh McCulloch, for Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, for General Nathaniel Prentice Banks, and so on. The list is very long. So 1 week later, Frank Buchser travels to Washington. He lives here in Abbott House, and he immediately starts visiting. So his very first visit is on 31st May 1866, and he visits, of course, William Henry Seward. And Mr. Seward is very pleased with the idea, and only a few days later he introduces Frank to Andrew Johnson, the president. And he introduces him as well to other important persons. So the game is one dignitary introduces Frank to the next, and Frank Buchser gets in touch with many politicians, with many army members, and with many different political ideas and many different opinions about civil war. And Frank realizes the situation is complicated. So although he came to glorify the victorious North, he considers it from different sides already now, and he sees many different factors. And already at this stage, Frank realizes another problem. Everybody he is introduced to wants to be on his paintings, which causes really problems. So on another day, Frank Buchser is invited by the Swiss consulate to a large dinner, and here he meets this man. This is Wilhelm August Sutter. Mr. Sutter at this time is in Washington because he tries to get compensation from Congress for the loss he had through the gold rush. And the two men, Mr. Sutter and Frank Buchser, they understand themselves very good, and they had quite a lot of bottles together. So Frank installs his atelier beside the Swiss consulate in Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, and he starts painting, but he does not start with a politician. He starts with Johann August Sutter. He makes this incredible portrait of him, and then after he has finished that, he does still not paint politicians. He starts painting the so-called blacklegs. He really is fascinated by these black people. He feels with the poor and the suppressed, and he is fascinated by the dark skin, and he likes these shoeshine boys, these newspaper boys, and he paints them. He invites newspapermen, and for the first time he had very, very good reports in the newspapers, but already now people do not like this at all. So only now he paints President Andrew Johnson, and I think it is one of the worst portraits he has ever done, and I even think he has not finished it, because if you look at this hair, we have no other portrait where he left the hair like a helmet, and I think he did let it lie because he was as well introduced to Senator William Sprague, the husband of Kate Chase, and these two men did understand them as well very good, are very soon friends. Mr. Sprague even offers to build an atelier for Frank, but Frank feared the depth, and overall he fears to lose his freedom. But still, Mr. Sprague invites Frank to an expedition to explore for the Pacific Railway, and General Sherman is the leader of the expedition, and with the expedition is as well his brother John Sherman. So Frank is very excited. He lets lie the portrait and travels with the expedition. He wants to see the landscape, he wants to see the Sioux and the Cheyenne, and he very soon is a friend of General Sherman. He estimates him a lot. He makes many, many sketches during this travel. He even makes oil sketches, very impressive ones. And he already at this stadium, he foresees the environmental damage that will be caused by the railway. So the travel has been very fast, and Frank decides that he will later travel alone and make more landscape painting. He is very soon back in Washington. In Washington, January, February, he can exhibit the blacklegs in Capitol, and again, and other paintings like these, the marblers. And this time he has very, very bad reports in the newspapers. Nobody wants to see these black poor people. And so it comes that the money starts to be the problem. So fortunately, the black legs and the marblers are bought by Mr. Henry D. Cook, and he has invited Frank Buchser as well, and he pays him for these paintings $3,200. And Frank receives this money in May 1867, and as soon as he has money enough, he travels. And this time it is Grant County, Virginia. He makes a lot of landscape, and he installs himself here in Woodstock. But here the atmosphere begins to be very hostile when he paints black people, and Frank almost must flee from here, and he goes to New York. And in October 1867, his brother arrives. This is Joseph Buchser. He is a physician, and he as well flees. He flees from an unhappy marriage. So for the winter 1867, the two brothers stay together in New York, but still the money is really the problem because nobody buys the paintings of black people. So Joseph advises 2 portraits. So this works so la la. And in early spring, there must have been an invitation from William Cullen Bryant. And Frank paints this large portrait of William Cullen Bryant. Bryant is very famous at the time, and Bryant loves this portrait. And he even recommends Frank to exhibit it in the Academy in New York, but this portrait is rejected for being too realistic and too brutal. But after this portrait, Frank really has a lot of orders for portrait. And he writes as well in his diary, and he writes, his judgment of America and Americans has turned several times already. So in July 1868, he has earned money enough, and always in summer he starts traveling again. And this time it is the Great Lakes. He makes a lot of landscape. This is a small, he calls it sketch. For us it is a real work. He makes very large paintings. He travels further to Sault Ste. Marie. He installs an atelier in the middle of the rapids on a rock, and he makes many large paintings of these rapids. And he stays quite a long time here. So towards end of the year, he travels to St. Louis. Here is General Sherman, and he wants to paint General Sherman. And General Sherman is very friendly to Frank. He invites him to stay for Christmas Eve, and Frank stays there and he paints. It takes, this is as well quite a large portrait. It takes time, and Frank stays until early spring in 1869. So exactly when this portrait is finished, arrives an invitation from William Henry Seward to come to Auburn. And Frank is very happy about this invitation. He immediately travels to Auburn. Around 1st of April, he is here. He must have installed an atelier somewhere. I think it could have been somewhere here in this barn. This is the barn again. And on April 7, we already have the first portrait. This one, I think it is made from a photo, I don't know really. Then he makes a wonderful painting in the garden, a very beautiful scene. And Frank really loves the life here. There are many guests, there are grand dinners in the evening, and he makes many sketches in pencil. Biographer Welchley says this is Janet Seward, the daughter-in-law of William Henry Seward. He makes sketches in nature. There are trips to the lakes, there are riding trips, and in the evening, the guests gather in the parlor, consider here this painting and consider the piano. And we have here even a closer view of the piano. And in the evening, ladies are playing piano. Frank himself is a very good player. He is a very good singer as well and a good dancer. And he does as well oil paintings. He makes Anne, that's the other daughter-in-law. She is the wife of Frederick Seward. And he makes this beautiful painting. This is Janet and the children. And the horse is called Frank. And he really loves to stay here. And among the guests is as well Olive Risley. And I found this photo with her sister. Probably her sister has been here as well. And Frank knows Olive quite good from invitations by Mr. Henry D. Cook, the man who bought the Blacklegs. And Frank Buchser as well starts painting the state's portrait of Mr. Seward. This is a very large portrait, and it is actually one of these paintings for the federal building in Switzerland. And personally, I think Mr. Seward told Frank a bit how he wanted it. So Frank really painted a lot here, and he writes in his diary. So at one point he complains that Mr. Seward expected paintings to be given for free, which is for Frank not possible because really he needs the money, as we know. And at another point he writes, the loop of love has been thrown around my neck, but he really says no more. What we know is on June 7, Anna, Frederick, the son, and his wife, and Seward himself left for a travel to Alaska. William Seward Jr., his wife Janet, the children, Olive, and probably her sister, and other relatives and friends are still in Auburn, and as well Frank, he stays. So he stays 1 month longer. The last sketch we have is this sketch of 5th of July. And so he quite long stays when Mr. William Henry Seward already was not any longer here. And Frank Buchser in his diary, he tells no more after Mr. Seward had left. So what we have is in his legacy, there are found photos. And we have this photo, which Welchley depicts in his biography. And here Frank has written with his own hand, that's the lady in Auburn who made my life to be in danger. There seems to be another photo, which I do not have, but Welchley says he has written a love in Auburn, and yet another photo where Frank has written a lady of high caste. That is really all we have. In July 1869, Frank Buchser returns to New York. Here his brother Joseph is meanwhile quite famous because he did the first transfusion of blood about 4 weeks before, and this has even been reported in the medical report of New York. So until now, Buchser has painted President Johnson, General Sherman, and Secretary of State William Seward. And until now, Frank Buchser has many different views over the political situation. So he decides at this point he wants to paint a general from the defeated army. And this is General Robert Edward Lee. In autumn 1869, Frank travels to Lexington. He has a few discussions before he is allowed, but then General Lee allows him to be painted. And Frank is very much impressed by this man. He writes many, many sides in his diary, and he has yet another perspective of the Civil War. End of October 1869, Buchser goes back to Washington, and he immediately, as always, immediately starts calling at all the persons he knows. He visits everybody he knows. And on October 31, he visits as well the new president, Mr. Grant, but Grant is not allowing him to paint him. Frank Buchser never painted Mr. Grant. But still, Frank continues visiting, and in his diary he writes explicitly. He visits as well ladies. We have many names, and very, very often he visits Virginia, and Frank says about her that she is a close friend of Olive Risley. So Virginia, we don't have the name of her. Virginia seems to have family in Philadelphia, and with Virginia, Frank really has a love affair. And as well, he visits Olive. She seems to me a little bit younger here on this photo. And in his diary, Frank says that he goes out riding with her, and he seems to be quite close to her. And this is already the time we have this to consider this, when Seward and Olive are very close already. And Buchser writes in his diary as well that Olive finds out that Frank has a love affair with Olive's girlfriend, Virginia. So during the autumn, Olive is being quite cold against Frank and does not receive him anymore. Towards the end of the year, everybody is back in Washington, as well as Mr. William Henry Seward himself. And here begins this very strange story about sleeve buttons. So Frank tells a very long story about these sleeve buttons. I do try to do it a little bit shorter. So what we know is the following. In December 28, Olive does receive Frank again, and during this evening, Frank seems to have been very, very impressed by her, and she starts to admire his sleeve buttons, and she makes him to give them to her. So Frank writes that she was a very beautiful woman, and he writes that they played piano forehand. And I think that this sketch already has been Olive. And Frank explicitly writes that he did not kiss her, which seemed to have been a very great effort on his side. So the very next day, Virginia realizes these sleeve buttons on the sleeves of Olive. And Virginia is very, very angry with Frank. She makes a large drama, and she ends the love with Frank. So Frank is really devastated. He writes many, many letters. He calls in vain. And only a few days later, on January 6th, but these days seem to have been very, very long for Frank, Virginia receives him again, and he swears his love, and she forgives him everything. And at this rendezvous here, Virginia teases Frank that rumors have it that he has kissed a Mrs. Seward in Auburn. But Frank really says no word about this in his diary. And at this same evening, Virginia tells him as well what Olivia wanted with these sleeve button. So she tells Olivia wanted to make it very visible that Frank is interested in Virginia, and this should prevent Olive's father, Hanson Risley, to love Virginia any longer, because she tells that the father of Olivia wanted to marry Virginia, and that Olive did not like this idea at all. So in his diary, Frank writes, Virginia goes after this story with Hanson Risley to Philadelphia, and I cite this. This is written like this in the diary, out of devilment, and I should not be surprised if out of the same devilment she marries him. And the last he writes, so we must remember Mr. Seward is the whole time in Washington as well. The last Frank writes is that he wants to hear this whole story from Olive herself. But in his diary, he does not say anything about it. But I personally, I am very sure that he tried to visit Olive again. I'm quite sure that he has seen her again, but he himself, he does not say any more word about it. So what we know is in February, Mr. Seward travels to Baltimore. And here in Baltimore, he receives a telegram from Hanson Risley that Olive is recovering from a severe typhoid disease. This is mentioned by biographer von Deussen, and he as well says that Seward's relation to Olive at that time had a bit cooled down. And he explicitly notices Mr. Seward did not visit Olive when she was ill, which seemed really to have been a little bit strange. But it seems as well this estrangement between Olive and William Henry Seward has smoothed soon, and as we all know, Mr. Seward adopted Olive later. So if we consider this whole story, it is very, very interesting that in the legacy of William Henry Seward, not a single word is found about Frank Buchser. Only once there is a Swiss artist mentioned in a letter of Janet Seward, but no biographies of about Mr. Seward ever mention one word about Frank Buchser, not Van Duysen, not any other. I found nothing. So in his diary, Frank Buchser never again mentions Olive, but in his legacy, there is something interesting found. We have in his legacy this photo here. He writes under it with his own hand, "Here I was wrong. I should have married you." And this formulation, "Hier habe ich gefehlt," which you see here, this formulation is suggests that something really went very, very wrong, terribly wrong. So we do not really know more. This is all we have and all we know. So towards the end of the year 1870, Frank Buchser complains that orders are not really coming in enough. His brother has already returned to Switzerland because he did not have patience enough, which might have been a problem of language here. And so Frank is very alone now, and very soon after Joseph, Frank Buchser as well returns to Switzerland. And I personally think he had a few love affairs, too many. And I think as well that the atmosphere in society has cooled considerably against Frank. So he did really not have a chance any longer here. So this is one story we know about Frank. I close here with the story. We have many more stories about Frank Buchser, of his travels, even in America and in the other countries as well. So Yes, I thank you very, very much for your attention. And if there are questions, yes, please ask.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I apologize to everyone who's tuned in. I neglected in my introduction to especially thank her for skipping dinner. It's 6 hours later where she is in Liechtenstein, and so we're having lunch. She's missing dinner, so we especially thank her for taking the time out and speaking to us from so far away, a subject that many of us around the Seward house thought we knew pretty well. The story of Mr. Seward, layers of Olive Risley, time in this house, family complications, and of course, the important journey of Frank Buchser. And I think it's especially worth paying attention to the fact that he alone amongst artists in the United States in the mid 1860s was interested in capturing communities of color. I think it's important that Barbara's emphasized that he's doing so from this place, from a Europe torn by revolution, his heart's with people who are dispossessed and oppressed, and he brings that with him here. A lot of this was news to me, and I wonder, Barbara, for those of us here around Auburn or in the US who want to read more about Frank Buchser, or maybe his diaries, that would be complicated, right? Because there are very few translations.
We have no translations. What we have is a diary where he writes quite a long story in English, but we really have only real biographies and transcriptions of his diaries in German, in written German. So I'm sorry about that. We really have no translations. Yes.
Alyssa is standing by, managing the Seward House Museum's Facebook account. Alyssa Morris, our Administrative and Visitor Services Coordinator. So if you're streaming this and you have questions, you can type them right into the chat. Alyssa can type them in and relay them to Barbara. As we wait to see if any of those come in, one last question from me. What becomes of many of the pieces that Buchser takes during his American tour? It seems like Seward expected to get a couple for free, or all of them for free, and does acquire the painting of Janet, the painting of Anna, but not the ones of himself. Where are many of these Buchser paintings today, if one wants to find them?
They are, today they are quite full whole in the museums. There is one museum in Basel, Kunstmuseum in Basel, and the other is in the city of Solothurn. They do have many works. And we have a third museum. It is the Buchser Museum from Mr. Leimer, and he has a very, very beautiful collection. He did this collection privately. The museums have very beautiful online collections, which you can see at any time. And we have the legacy of him has actually gone to these two museums, Basel and Solothurn. And there has been activities to buy back paintings that he has left, that he has sold in the United States, as an example, the Blacklegs. And there has been a gallerist, he's called Bolak in Zurich, who has very, very early started buying paintings back from United States to Switzerland. But I'm quite sure that we have many, many portraits, especially in America, from Frank Buchser, and nobody knows who has been this Frank Buchser. And I fear that many of them have been destroyed as well. But the large paintings are mostly in Switzerland, many of them.
Good to know. Alyssa, anybody asking any questions on Facebook right now?
Not yet, but we do have a lot of people saying thank you and saying that the presentation was very, very interesting.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Thank you. Yes.
I'm looking now and I'm seeing that our friend Melinda from the University of Rochester, Rushries Library, Department of Rare Books, where the Seward archives are, has tuned in, and she wants us to know that there are 4 letters in their collection between Seward and Frank Buchser from March 1868, March 1869, and April 1869. And she shared some contact information, Barbara, that I'll pass along to you, and perhaps you'll be able to get copies of those letters.
Okay, yes, that's very good. I did not know that they have been writing hin und her. So yes, that is very interesting.
Well, Barbara, I'm not seeing any more, and unless Alyssa is, we know we've kept you past dinner, and we've really enjoyed the time spent with you, your research into Buchser and his time in Auburn. This video will live on in our video archive, and if you've not caught it live, please tune in now. If there are questions that come up later, we'd be happy to email those to Barbara, who I'm sure would try her best to answer them. And we just, again, thank you so much for doing this research and for tying a story that seems so far away and so many aspects to Seward and to Auburn for us today.
Yes, thank you very much as well. It was the first time I did a Zoom presentation, so it was a very, very interesting experience for me. Thank you very, very much.
Our next live stream lunch is just about 2 weeks away on May 26th at noon. There's a new book coming out about Seward and Confederate spy ring. If you've never heard of the name Rose Greenhow, you'll know a lot more about her after next Wednesday at noon. A new book, we're going to have details about that coming out on our Facebook account with a special code you can enter if you want to buy at a discount. So we look forward to seeing everybody again in the next 2 weeks. And Barbara, we hope that you will come and visit us in Auburn when you can travel safely to the States.
We have it already on plan, yes.